Okay, first I have a disclaimer to make, and that is that I am a federal employee, but I'm not representing the federal government here today. I'm on leave, doing this on my own time of my own volition. I represent Maryland Shall Issue. We're a civil rights organization. We're all volunteer, non-partisan organization dedicated to the preservation and advancement of firearms rights in the state of Maryland. We seek to educate the community about the right of self-protection, the safe handling of firearms, and the responsibility that goes with carrying a firearm in public. And that's an enormous responsibility. I'm here today to talk about the Firearm Safety Act of 2013 and very specifically the effect that it had on Baltimore City. So how dangerous is Baltimore City? It's the 23rd most dangerous city in the world. If you drive an hour north of here, you would be safer in San Salvador, El Salvador, Guatemala City, or San Pedro Sula, Honduras. I know that's very hard to imagine sitting here, but that is in fact the truth. So we know that we had a crime problem in Baltimore, and the General Assembly implemented the following solution. They decided that they wanted to further limit the ability of a person to wear, carry, or transport a handgun. They wanted to require a license for a person to be able to purchase a handgun. And to obtain the license, the person had to go to a shooting range and fire at least one shot from that handgun. They wanted to ban the sale of magazines that held more than 10 bullets. They wanted to designate certain firearms as quote-unquote assault weapons and prohibit their transportation through the state with very few exceptions. And they wanted to ban the sale of 45 designated assault weapons. The Attorney General, Brian Fauch, now wants to increase that list because someone was shot with a firearm that wasn't on the list. So how did this work out for Maryland and Baltimore in particular? And I'd like to stress that all the data that I'm presenting to you today comes from the FBI, and it comes from the City of Baltimore's open data portal, and from the Giffords organization, which is an anti-gun organization. There's no data here from the NRA or any pro-gun rights group. So this is deaths by shooting in Baltimore City, and these are only deaths by shooting. They're not deaths by stabbing or baseball bat or any means. Prior to the implementation of the Firearm Safety Act, the population was going down in Baltimore, and then it leveled out, and deaths by shootings were also going down. The act was implemented in late 2013. And what happened was the population began to decrease again, and deaths by shooting doubled, going from about 150 to 300 per year, and they have not come down since. So now let's take a look at Baltimore versus its sister cities or peer cities in terms of population, wealth, and proximity. Baltimore has the strongest gun control as measured by Giffords in any city of like population. And if we look, Albuquerque, which has an F, had 61 murders by firearms. Baltimore had 318. And in terms of robbery by firearm, Louisville, which had a Giffords grade of F, had the lowest number. If we then go and look in terms of affluence and look at murders and robbery, and this is the most interesting slide in the bunch because it has the only outlier, which is San Diego. San Diego has a Giffords grade of A. It's one of the strongest Giffords grades out there. Baltimore has an A-. San Diego had 35 murders by firearm. Baltimore had 342. There's something to keep in mind, however, with San Diego. San Diego is roughly 3 times the area that Baltimore is. So San Diego is more like a large suburb than an actual city. And another factor to consider as well is that the median income in San Diego is $40,000 more than the median income in Baltimore City. And as you can see, a C and a C plus kind of have the best scores in terms of crimes with firearms in cities of affluence. So not a great deal of gun control, okay, and not no gun control at all. And what I've seen in my studies is that once we go beyond doing a background check for a person at purchase, the rate of firearms crime seems to rise. Now we'll look at murder and robbery by firearms in terms of proximity. And the most interesting city here is Philadelphia. Philadelphia is 2.5 times the population that Baltimore does, but it has less murders than Baltimore, and it has almost as many robberies by firearm. And that's really incredible considering how much larger Philadelphia is than Baltimore and how close it is to Baltimore. This is a sore subject in Maryland, and it's what's happening in Baltimore's tourist areas. And if you've watched the news, we're seeing more and more attacks of innocent people within the tourist areas of Baltimore City, to the point where the restaurants are starting to close and leave, and people are no longer starting to go to Baltimore City due to fears for their safety. So firearms crime in the Inner Harbor, which is probably the largest tourist area in Baltimore, rose in all categories. If we look at Little Italy, firearms crime also rose there after the Firearm Safety Act of 2013. And more concerningly is in Little Italy, you would see from time to time a robbery with a firearm, but you never really saw assaults with a firearm in Little Italy. Now we're starting to see people being assaulted with firearms in Little Italy. Fells Point, firearm crime again on the rise since 2013, and more problematic is we're starting to see more shootings, and we're starting to see assaults with firearms in Fells Point, where we really didn't see that many before. Now we're going to look at Baltimore's transition neighborhoods. And you're probably thinking, well, who picked a transition neighborhood? Baltimore picked them in Live Baltimore. They identified what they thought were the best neighborhoods, up-and-coming neighborhoods in Baltimore City. And it's certainly true that those particular neighborhoods, the real estate prices are rising quite rapidly. But that's true all over the country. So if we look at Bridgeview Greenlawn, robberies, assaults, and shootings, they're all rising. If we look at Reservoir Hill, shootings have risen every year since the Firearm Safety Act of 2013 was put into place. If we look at Woodburn McCabe, shootings would have risen every year, except for 2016, where we had an anomaly and there were no shootings at all, but assaults with firearms rose every year. So I'd like to talk about Washington, D.C., and something very interesting happened on May 27th of 2016, and that is the court said that the good and substantial requirement to get a permit to carry a firearm in Washington, D.C. was unconstitutional. And Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and California all begged the District of Columbia not to appeal that decision to the Supreme Court, because those are the holdout states that are May issue. And they were afraid that it would be overturned or upheld, rather. So on this slide, if you take nothing away from this presentation today, please take this slide away. We have different categories of violent crime. We have murder, rape, robbery, and assault. And then we have the percentage increase. And the one criticism that I anticipated from this slide is people would say, well, you know, this is really existing trends that continued. So what I did was I went back to the prior year and I found out what the velocity was of the change from one year to the next. So in Baltimore City, all violent crime increased. Murders up by 7.6%, which is twice as fast as the prior year. Rape increased 6 times as much, up 27.8%. Robbery increased half as fast, but that's still a rise of 12.3%. Assaults increased about the same rate at 13%. Look at the District of Columbia during the same time frame. Okay? Murders dropped by the same amount, 15.9%. Rapes and robberies fell by more than a factor of threefold. Rapes decreased by 16%, robberies decreased by over 25%, and assaults decreased by almost twice as much. So we'll talk about some indisputable facts. In terms of curtailing firearms violence in Baltimore City, the Firearm Safety Act of 2013 was an abysmal failure. Deaths by shooting in Baltimore City doubled 1 year after that act was passed, and they have not come down since. The so-called transition neighborhoods, which Baltimore identifies as their best neighborhoods, have increasing home prices, but people are paying more to live in a more dangerous neighborhood. And they're transitioning from bad to worse in terms of robberies, assaults, and shootings with firearms. And most significantly, if someone is assaulted, robbed, or shot with a firearm in Baltimore's tourist areas on a weekly basis. I want to talk about causal factors because gun control is sold on the fact that it's impossible to shoot someone without a firearm, right? But the two factors that no one seems to ever talk about is that it's nearly impossible to defend yourself from someone with a firearm without having a firearm yourself. And it's also nearly impossible to defend yourself against someone who's much bigger and stronger than you, especially if you're elderly, disabled, or female, without a firearm. So I'm going to argue to you today that gun control is positively correlated to crime with firearms. So I'm going to make that argument based on the Bradford Hill causality theorem. Criteria number one in Bradford Hill, and this theorem was first used to prove that smoking causes lung cancer. The first criteria is strength of association. Deaths by shooting in Baltimore City doubled after they passed one of the strongest gun control acts in the nation. The second criteria is consistency, meaning we repetitively observe the same behavior over and over again, okay? And as I've shown you in the previous slides, those cities that have high Giffords gun control grades have higher rates of crime with firearms. We see that over and over again. Just as with a smoker, it doesn't matter whether you're a smoker in the United States or you're a smoker in Nepal or you're a smoker in Russia. You have a higher higher chance of getting lung cancer. Specificity, death by shooting is specific to firearms. Temporality. The potential causal factor precedes the outcome. If you get lung cancer, but you start smoking after you get lung cancer, then smoking didn't cause the lung cancer, okay? And what we saw in Baltimore City was this effect happened very shortly after they passed the Firearm Safety Act of 2013. A gradient exists. We see this also. The higher the Giffords grade, the more firearms violence we have in a particular city. Just as a 3-pack-a-day smoker is much more likely to get lung cancer than a 1-pack-a-day smoker. Similarly, the stronger the gun laws in a particular area, the more likely you are to have violent crime against innocent people with firearms. Plausibility. It's plausible that limiting the ability of a law-abiding citizen to readily and expediently acquire a firearm for self-defense will make them a more attractive target for a criminal. Coherence. The causal conclusion does not contradict established literature. And we see this. Lott, Koppel, Halbert, Kleck. They've all published peer-reviewed literature that states this is the case, and that is not in contradiction here. Criteria 8. Experiment. The data should support the claim that A causes B. If we feel that air pollution causes lung cancer, if we reduce air pollution, at some point we would expect to see lung cancer to go down. In the cities that implement gun control, by and large, we do not see that crime with firearms is reduced. Criteria 9 is similar behavior in analogous circumstances. Cities with high crime rates that enact strong gun control tobacco invariably only see crime rise faster. It's true in Chicago, Newark, Camden, Oakland, so forth. And just as with smokers, we see other tobacco users also have higher incidences of cancer. For example, people who chew tobacco have a higher incidence of mouth cancer. People who smoke a pipe have a higher incidence of mouth cancer and lung cancer. The argument that I hear all the time, and is probably the most misused phrase in research, is correlation does not prove causation, but it does more often than it doesn't. Correlation proves causation when the Bradford-Hill causality theorem is satisfied, when there are no confounders, and when a causal factor clearly links the two items. So let me give you some examples. Does moving to Florida cause Alzheimer's disease? Absolutely not. Most people who move to Florida have one foot in the grave already, okay? They're already sick, okay? And it's age that causes Alzheimer's disease. Does carrying a lighter cause lung cancer? Well, if the lighter's radioactive and you place it in this pocket, maybe, okay? But most of us can agree on that. Does smoking cause lung cancer? Well, everyone thinks so except Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, right? There's a causal factor. You're introducing poison into your body. A lot of people don't know nicotine is a terrible poison. If you could extract the pure nicotine from a cigarette and administer it to someone, it would kill them. You're also introducing particulate matter into your lungs, which causes inflammation. And inflammation causes DNA damage, and cancer, by definition, is faulty DNA. Does gun control cause increased crime? I would argue yes. The causal link is that guns are necessary for self-protection. The mechanism of action is that the victim has no fear of being shot to death by their intended victim. And the reduction of access to firearms by criminals is impossible in a free society. If we want to run this country like North Korea or Russia, or we can search and seize without a warrant, and we can stop people on the street and frisk them and take whatever they have, gun control has a chance of working. If we want to live in a free society like we have now, this has no chance of working. So conclusions. It can be said with certainty that after Maryland passed one of the strongest gun control laws, annual deaths by shooting in Baltimore City doubled. It can also be said that all of the extremely strict gun laws Maryland has passed over the years have had no effect on crime in Baltimore City, because crime in Baltimore City has not gone down. And if we believe the Bradford-Hill causality theorem, as most people do, that if we go beyond a point-of-sale NICS background check, more gun control causes an escalation in crime with firearms for the locality that implement it. I just wanted to try and dispel some common myths. One thing that I heard Barack Obama say was, he said that the type of mass violence that we see in the United States doesn't happen in other places. Yes, it does. In terms of mass shooting, we're not even in the top 5, okay? And that's remarkable considering how many firearms are owned by how many people in this country. The top 5, Kenya, Pakistan, France, Norway, and Kenya again, all have strong gun control. There's a claim out, and CBS News, USA Today, Huffington Post, and even the conservative Fox network says we had more mass shootings in the United States than days in 2019. Is this true? Well, the definition that they used was 4 or more people killed or injured. Well, 4 people injured in gun violence is a tame weekend in Baltimore or Chicago. That's the reality. I've broken this data down and I've looked at it. Okay? For their claim, the median number of people killed was 0. The number injured was 4. And if you look over here, if breaking these down, about 80% of them, less than 1 person was killed in these so-called mass shootings. So what I did was I constructed some reasonable significant thresholds, being 3 standard deviations out from all the shootings in the country. So if you had 7 people killed, or 12 people injured, or a total of more than 16 people shot, I would consider that a mass shooting. We have 4 this year. 2 of them met all the criteria above. 2 met 2 out of 3. And those were El Paso, Virginia Beach, Dayton, and Gilroy. Looking at the data that they provide for mass shootings, I was curious, well, where are they occurring? They're occurring in the localities that have the strongest gun laws. They're occurring in Chicago, they're occurring in Baltimore. Gifford's grade of B+, Gifford's grade of A-. This is a fallacy that I want to talk about. It's the fallacy of limiting the amount of bullets that can be carried in a magazine. What has happened is, in the instance of the Columbine shooting, the shooter just carried 13 10-round magazines. He knew he was going there to shoot a bunch of people, so he took the appropriate equipment with him. The Virginia Tech shooter brought 17 magazines, and most of them were limited to 10 rounds. I think he had maybe 2 quote-unquote high-capacity magazines. The Newton shooter brought 3 guns. Now, who does this hurt? Women and the elderly who seek to protect themselves against something like a home invasion, and home invasions are a lot more common than mass shootings, they're going to have to fumble to reload their firearm. And these people usually work in groups of 2 or 3 to subdue people within their homes. And if you look at what the U.S. Department of Justice says about the assault weapons ban and the ban on high-capacity magazine, they said it had no discernible effect on crime. So what's next? I personally believe that handgun permits in the state of Maryland are discriminatory. And I have asked the state of Maryland for every single handgun application requested for the date, race, county, zip code, birth year, and disposition of that permit. And it will allow us to make a determination if a white person in affluent Howard County is more likely to get a permit than, say, a Hispanic person in Prince George's County or a black person in Baltimore City. And one of the reasons I believe this is the case is the Maryland State Police has articulated a financial requirement toward getting a permit. They want to see a certain number of financial transactions in your bank account to support the fact that you need a permit. And I'll tell you what I've seen happening. You can have a person who's very wealthy in Howard County who owns a restaurant, and they have an armored car that comes to their restaurant to pick up their cash and deposit it in the bank every day. That person has no problem going to the Maryland State Police and saying, see, I need a permit. I'm making bank deposits every day. You could have a Hispanic housemaid in Prince George's County, okay? She cleans 5 different houses every day of the week. They pay her in cash. She's on the bus, public transportation every day with cash. She can't make it to the bank during the week. Okay, she's got to pick her kids up at the bus stop because she doesn't want them there alone. She's got family things to do on the weekend. She makes it to the bank maybe once a month. Guess what? No permit for her. So we put this request in, and the Maryland State Police said, no, we're not giving it to you. And on knowledge and belief, they have a database with all this information. And I said, well, you can refuse to query your database for us, but you can't refuse us the paper records. I said, there's nothing personally identifiable in the information that we've requested. And they've come back and said, well, we'll give that to you for a nominal fee of $319,000. And Attorney General Brian Frosh, who said that every legitimate PIA request should be fulfilled in the cheapest, most cost-effective manner, has not helped us at all, and neither is Governor Hogan. So the matter is currently under mediation, and I would expect that we would have to go to court to get this information. And by the way, the ombudsman said, oh, this mediation has to remain confidential, even though it's for public data. So parting thoughts. You hear this all the time. Common sense dictates the need for more gun control. I remember I was a high school senior. I went into an AP English class. First thing the teacher wrote on the board was common sense tells us that the earth is flat. I don't know why I never forgot that, but I never forgot that. And I happened to look the quote up, and a person named Stuart Chase wrote it. And he also wrote, for those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who don't, no proof is possible. But I think the best quote here is from Judge Judy, and my wife loves Judge Judy. She tapes her on the DVR every time. And the thing that Judge Judy says all the time is that if something doesn't make sense, it's not true. And the thought that I would leave you with is, does it make sense that making it difficult or prohibiting an honest person from owning a gun is going to deter a criminal from acquiring a gun or misusing a gun? Now, to me, personally, that's like saying, I'm going to prohibit non-smokers from buying cigarettes, and that's going to reduce lung cancer. I have a couple books out. I operate in this space on a volunteer basis. I worked at Pfizer for 16 years as a scientist and a data analyst. The second version of my automated data analysis book is coming out next year, so a little shameless self-promotion there, and just some people that I would like to acknowledge. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.